Well, it looks like 7 o'clock. Good evening, everybody. My name is Charlie Kurtz, and I am with NDSU Learning Applied and Innovation Center. Welcome to the second annual Spring Teaching and Learning Conference. So let me hand this over now to Dr. Stacy Dupfield to introduce you to our keynote.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I just want to begin first of all by welcoming you to this opening session of our 2022 NDSU Teaching and Learning Conference, hosted by both the Office of Teaching and Learning and the Learning and Applied Innovation Center here at NDSU. In addition to tonight's excellent opening keynote, we have a valuable morning tomorrow of breakout sessions that are led by instructors from NDSU and around the North Dakota University system. There'll be 30-minute sessions that align with our 4 tracks of supporting student mental health, building an inclusive classroom, improving student learning through skill development, and improving student learning with technology tools. And then we wrap up with a conference closing keynote luncheon where Dr. Tammy Jolly-Trottier will present on the most important work that you'll ever do is on yourself. We'll also announce the winners of the Innovation in Teaching and Inspiring Colleague Awards tomorrow at lunch. And for more information on those sessions, please see the Office of Teaching and Learning website or the email you received when you registered. Our opening keynote speaker tonight for this year's conference is Dr. Shannon Davidson. She's a leader in applied research and evaluation at the Education Northwest and is the author of Trauma-Informed Practices for Post-Secondary Education. Shannon has delivered trainings in trauma-informed practices for post-secondary education at numerous places, including the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as a variety of higher education institutions like Columbia College, Clackamas Community College, and Kutztown University. She's led formative, summative, and developmental evaluation and technical assistance projects for clients like Gear Up, Portland State University, Omaha Public Schools, Wyoming Department of Education, and the Oregon Department of Education. She's enthusiastic about connecting schools and youth development programs with strategies to foster skills and competencies that prepare youth for success in learning and in life. A former classroom teacher, Shannon seeks opportunities to complement research and evaluation work with coaching and technical assistance. And she's dedicated to helping partners translate data into meaningful action, using research as a tool to promote learning and improvement. Shannon holds a PhD in international and comparative education from Stanford University and has a background in both domestic and global issues in education. Her dissertation, funded by the Fulbright Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad Fellowship, was an investigation of mental health policies and practices in China. And I am going to now turn this over to Dr. Shannon Davidson to share with us about trauma-informed practices. Thank you, Dr. Davidson.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for welcoming me into this space tonight to help kick off your teaching and learning conference. It's a real honor and privilege to be here with you tonight, and excited to learn from you and to learn together. And in just a minute, we will, well, let's start with some introductions. I believe the way things are set up is that I will be able to see the chat. So I would love to ask you to take a moment to please just type in the chat your name and a little something about your role at North Dakota State University, whether that's as a faculty member. You can share a bit about what you teach. It would just be nice to know a little something about you and who's in this space together with us. So if you're able to, just type in the chat. But I think this just demonstrates the wealth of different experiences here in the room. So I definitely want to take time to acknowledge that you are doing this work. You are with students, you are with colleagues, you are working in an education setting, doing this work every day. So my hope tonight is that you will learn something that confirms or affirms some practices that you find you're already doing that are trauma-informed, and perhaps also pick up some new ideas as well. So to get a little bit of sense of familiarity with the principles and the concepts of trauma-informed practices, I'm going to launch a quick poll. The poll question is, how comfortable do you feel with trauma-informed practice? So if this is all new to you, if this is the first time you're interacting with the term trauma-informed practice, then you can select that option. If you know a little bit, but you still have a lot to learn, you can choose that selection. If you're already really in a position where you're teaching trauma-informed practices or helping others, there's that option as well. And so far it looks like most of us are in the new to me and learning and growing space. We have a couple of experts in the room. So again, I hope that you hear some things that resonate or confirm your knowledge and your practices. And I really do encourage you throughout this presentation to let me know your ideas in the chat. We will also be pausing about halfway through for a bit of Q&A. So I believe there's a Q&A option as well where you can contribute reactions, questions, thoughts, or ideas that come up as we go through this presentation together. So I wish we could be all together in one room. This is always more fun when it can be interactive and have more discussion, but we will do our best with this virtual setting. And I really do encourage you to make use of the chat and the Q&A to let me know what's resonating and what questions you have as we go. Okay, here we go. So our learning objectives tonight are to gain awareness of trauma through an equity lens and to understand how trauma affects learning and development here in a post-secondary education setting. We're going to talk about some strategies for how to work effectively with learners who may be navigating trauma, may have been exposed to trauma, and to do so while you're also personally navigating the very real effects of secondary or vicarious trauma that happens when you are in a teaching or caring profession. And finally, a chance to reflect on the importance of relationships and the role of personal connections as protective and healing factors. And this, again, if we were in person, I probably would have printed out a little organizer for you to take notes on. I find this to be a really simple but effective way to organize notes or thoughts during presentations like this one. It's just a simple traffic light activity where as you listen, you can identify practices that you may want to stop or consider doing differently based on the ideas that we share tonight, or something that you recognize is trauma-informed and has worked well for you that you want to continue doing, or perhaps a new idea for something that you would like to try to start doing as you move forward with your own work. So we will come back to this at the very end. In the Q&A, I'd love to hear what some of you come up with for this traffic light activity at the end of the presentation. So I would encourage you, if you have a pen and paper handy, to just take your own notes and use this as a chance to do some practice reflection on your own. And I understand that you have some really interesting breakout sessions happening tomorrow. I understand there will be topics including mental health, creating inclusive classrooms or learning spaces, technology and skill building. So also, keep those topics in mind as we talk about trauma-informed practices. And I hope that as you go through those breakout sessions tomorrow, you may be able to consider, how do I do this in a trauma-informed way? So I think it's very important in any discussion of trauma-informed practices to ground this discussion in equity, in an equity framework. So that's where we're going to begin tonight. We'll start by kind of centering the topic of trauma-informed practices in equity, and then we'll move on to focusing on trauma in education. So what is trauma? When we talk about trauma-informed practices, what exactly are we talking about? So of course, there is no real single definition of trauma. It manifests differently for different individuals and different communities. But in 2014, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, gathered a convening of experts, of researchers who work in the field of trauma, trauma survivors, practitioners from various disciplines, to kind of come up with some definitional principles and ways of speaking about trauma. And this is a definition that came out of that convening about individual trauma, which is that individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, or spiritual well-being. So this is a helpful definition for thinking about individual trauma, but I do want to challenge us to broaden that definition of trauma and think about not just the way that it manifests for individuals, but also really comes from broader societal conditions and circumstances. So one way to think about that is to look at how this graphic has evolved over the years. What this is the Center for Disease Control's Adverse Childhood Experiences Pyramid. So some of you, especially those of you who have worked in trauma-informed practice before, may have heard of ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this came from a series of studies that were conducted by Kaiser Permanente and CDC in the 90s. In 1995 and 1997, people were trying to figure out why certain groups of people experienced health disparities. And something that came out of those studies was that traumatic experiences such as abuse, neglect, household dysfunction put members of certain groups at a greater risk for health disparities and eventually for earlier mortality or earlier death. So they called those experiences adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And the number of ACEs that someone has is known as an ACE score. So on the left is the graphic that came out of those original studies in the 90s. And you can see it sort of starts with adverse childhood experiences. And you can see how it kind of cascades into various, health behaviors that are more likely to lead to earlier mortality. And, this remains a very foundational study, and it's hard to talk about trauma without talking about ACEs, but thinking about trauma has really evolved since those studies of mostly white people in the 90s, which really, has led to a foundational but ultimately pretty limited way of talking about trauma. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how our understanding of trauma has evolved. And I want to point out that it is reflected in the evolution of this graphic. So you can see here, this is the current version of the ACEs pyramid that is in use by the CDC. And you can see now there are two new rows on the bottom. It doesn't just start with adverse childhood experiences, but explains a little bit how broader social conditions and context, generational embodiment of historical trauma can lead to adverse childhood experiences. So in other words, it's not just a coincidence that some people may have higher ACE scores than others. There are very important social context factors that need to be taken into account. And as a result, largely out of the disproportionate negative effects of our current, our COVID-19 pandemic for communities of color, the CDC has actually very recently just officially designated racism as a public health risk. So this is a statement from the CDC Director, Rochelle Walensky, in 2021 that I can just read. The pandemic illuminated inequities that have existed for generations and revealed for all of America a known but often unaddressed epidemic impacting public health, which is racism. What we know is this: racism is a serious public health threat that directly affects the well-being of millions of Americans, and as a result, it affects the health of our entire nation. So as she recognizes, this is not news to many people, but by linking racism directly to public health, it may pave the way to directing new resources towards addressing some of those systemic kind of root causes of trauma and other health disparities. So with that in mind, we can think about trauma not just as an individual experience. It can be, and it can come from an acute event such as an accident or an assault, a natural disaster, witnessing a traumatic event. It can also come from an accumulation of conditions that exist on more of an ongoing basis, which is chronic stress. And that can come from ongoing conditions of abuse, violence, experiencing poverty, abandonment of an adult figure. And sometimes we talk about that as developmental stress or chronic stress. So individual trauma is definitely an important part of trauma. But it can also exist at a broader level, even at the level of a community. And it can be passed through generations, through experiences of poverty, long-term unemployment, as a result of chronic disinvestment in communities and loss of resources. It can take hold of generations who have experienced war and genocide, and in fact, descendants of communities who have experienced war and genocide, which we'll talk about a little more in a second. Just can come from as a result of, in general, environments that are dangerous or deteriorated, social isolation or disconnection from social networks and social resources. And, you know, racism affects health through a lot of channels, like access to food, safe drinking water, safe transportation. But we're also learning about a new way that, that racism affects public health, which is through the field of epigenetics. And I very quickly hit the limit of my ability to describe the science of epigenetics, but as I understand it, it has to do with the way that cells read genes. So it has to do with gene expression in the body. And what early evidence is suggesting is that children have trauma responses, physiological trauma responses to events that their parents, grandparents, or even ancestors have endured in the past. So this can include experiences of slavery, genocide, as has happened in our indigenous communities, the Holocaust. There's, you know, more comprehensive biological evidence of this in animal studies because it's difficult to study in humans. But there are there's suggestions that at the actual cellular level, your genes will express differently based on trauma responses that you inherit from your parents and grandparents. So again, this all just points to the idea that trauma is not one single thing. I think a lot of people think of PTSD or somebody who has experienced, you know, great childhood distress, but trauma can really be much broader than that and can extend over space and even over time. So this is why it's important, I think, to take the time to ground this topic in the idea of equity. So people are different and have different unique needs and strengths, and the types of tools and approaches that you will want to take when enacting trauma-informed practices are going to look different depending on who you're working with. And you know your students better than anybody. You know your community and the resources that are available to you. So your trauma-informed practices are going to look different than somebody else's, because the most important thing is knowing the people around you and what they are bringing to the table and what they need. So there are several different graphics that get circulated around to demonstrate the concept of equity. You may have seen one of people trying to look over a fence into a baseball field. I like this one because it demonstrates that the idea of trauma-informed practices, or really any equity work, is that you're not trying to change an individual. You're trying to give individuals the tools that will allow them to access their own unique strengths to be able to move forward. So in this graphic, you can see different people of varying sizes and ability. If you give everybody the same bicycle, which is what would be sort of the concept of equality, equal tools, it's just not going to be accessible to people with different needs. So if you customize the tools and resources that you give people to allow them to use the strengths that they have, then that's what we think of when we talk about equity. So the best part of all this too is that it ends up benefiting all learners. So trauma-informed practices are just good practices. And if you take the time to focus on it, everybody is going to end up benefiting regardless of their own experience of trauma or not. So here are just some key takeaways from this idea of grounding trauma-informed practices in an equity framework. A trauma-informed approach should be strengths-based. It should be culturally responsive, really based on knowing and connecting with the people that are in your sphere. Trauma can be a collective experience. It's not just an individual experience. I would call on everyone to resist ignoring or discounting lived experiences with racism or with white privileges. We all bring our experiences and our own bias to the table, and I just resist, or I encourage everyone to really lean into those conversations and have tough conversations about the type of bias or the type of lived experience that you are bringing to this. And the last one's really important. Promoting well-being goes beyond just reducing pathology. And I think that's why a lot of people are eager to kind of move past just talking about ACEs or the ACEs study, because ultimately that study was about living longer. And actually, I think the original study was mostly based on obesity. And when you're talking about trauma-informed practices, it's not enough to just be getting people to survive. We really want the students and the people in our communities to thrive. And just remember that people are more than what happened to them. Another kind of thing that you may have heard a lot if you have studied trauma-informed practice at all is this adage that, don't ask what's wrong with someone, ask what happened to someone. And I think that is helpful, but again, I would encourage us to go beyond that and remember that people are more than a collection of experiences. So let's move now into talking a little bit more directly about how this all matters and functions in a learning space and how trauma impacts learning. So again, I quickly reached my limit of being able to talk about brain science, which is unfortunate to me because I think it's just so fascinating, and I wish I could speak eloquently about it. But it is important, I think, to take a moment and talk a little bit about the brain science part of trauma, because it has a real direct effect on the way people behave when they're having a sort of an activated trauma response. So there's a little part of the brain, a little almond-shaped, oval-shaped part of the brain called the amygdala. And this is essentially responsible, like a tiny little switchboard, for directing information that comes into our brain into where it's going to go. So if you take a piece of information in, the amygdala might direct it to the more sort of emotional parts of the brain, the lower brain, that are associated with basic reactions like fight, flight, or freeze. Or it may direct that information eventually up to the sort of higher parts of the brain, the cortex, where it's responsible for making decisions, for things like executive function and making memories, the kind of thinking parts of the brain. So the amygdala is a small part of the brain that plays a really important role in terms of how we're ultimately going to respond to information that comes in. And it's normal and healthy to have a fight, flight, or freeze response if your brain detects a threat in the environment. It's how we all are able to stay alive by responding to stressors or possible dangerous inputs that we receive by just being part of the world. So it's necessary for survival. If you see, a house on fire or a bear, you're likely to have a fight or flight response, and that's part of healthy neurological functioning. But for individuals who are impacted by trauma, it's essentially as if the amygdala is a switch that gets stuck in the on position and becomes overactive and can lead to heightened emotional responses that are not just greater in intensity, but also endure for longer and are harder to switch out of that that emotional response and into a more sort of productive thinking and learning part of the brain. So it leads to a stress response that is heightened, that is prolonged, and that impacts other areas of life. So what that looks like in a classroom or in another learning environment is, if you are a student and you detect some stress in the environment, your nervous system is going to send that message to the amygdala, and your brain is going to send a message that, I'm not safe, I'm not in a safe space, which then starts a kind of a cascading series of physical changes of distress responses in the body. So stress hormones such as cortisol are produced and will flood the system. And at that point, you may hear terms like a flipped lid, or somebody who is having an activated trauma response. And that means that this, for that individual, they're in that heightened state of distress that really makes learning difficult, if not impossible. So you can imagine if you were trying to do a word problem while being chased by a bear, that's obviously a sort of an exaggerated example, but if your brain is experiencing a lack of safety and a heightened emotional response, it's very difficult to move into a place where you're processing information or having controlled executive functioning. And things that we may think of as kind of normal, everyday parts of the learning environment can sometimes be enough to send somebody into that heightened state of response. So, for example, having a lack of choices. This is, a feature of a learning environment that's fairly common. There's a certain set of protocols or a set of rules or a certain way of trying to get to the answer to a problem that can create that stress response for somebody who is navigating trauma. Ambiguity is another feature, especially in a post-secondary education setting. There's so many new roles that students are learning to navigate, new environments, new ways of doing things, and sometimes the rules are not always clear, and students may not, it just may not be apparent why somebody is being asked to do something in a certain way. And that kind of ambiguity can be another kind of activator for somebody who's experiencing trauma. Unclear rules, again, has to do with that ambiguity. Being forced to share, sometimes, especially in getting to know you activities or team building exercises is another one up here. There may be some invitations to share personal information or to share parts of your story that a lot of people don't want to share and don't feel comfortable sharing with a room full of people that they don't know. So just being in that environment of being asked to share and possibly even being put into physical sort of situations, like some team building exercises that may involve things like holding hands or even, being blindfolded or doing things with loud noises. These are the kinds of things that we may take for granted as sort of part of college fun or college orientation or just kind of everyday parts of experience, may be especially activating for those of us in the community who are dealing with trauma. So what are some things that you might see? How will you know if you are working with a student or a colleague or anyone in the community who might be having that activated trauma response? You might see things like the student is having difficulty focusing, difficulty attending or retaining information, or when asked to recall information that may appear to be difficult. You might see absenteeism, a tendency to miss a lot of classes, which is understandable. If classes are the source of feeling unwell, it's natural that somebody may wish to avoid that situation. You may see challenges with emotional regulation, so temper flares. You may see physical agitation, signs of distress. You may see a heightened fear of taking risks, or more anxiety about deadlines or exams, being asked to work in a group, being asked to speak in public. You may see some things that suggest feelings of anger or hopelessness, or even dissociation, or kind of, mentally checking out when having a stressful experience. This may manifest as withdrawal or isolation, or what seems to be involvement in unhealthy relationships. And I think something really important to remember when you're noticing things and it possibly maybe causing you frustration as an educator, is that at some point in someone's life, this behavior was adaptive, was helping somebody out of a situation. It may have even been serving as a sort of a survival function for someone. So some of the behaviors that now appear to be very maladaptive, and you wonder, why, if someone would just stop doing X, Y, or Z, then things would be better. It's just important to remember that at some point that behavior served a purpose and it came from somewhere. And it can be ill-advised and sometimes even dangerous to ask somebody to very abruptly or quickly change a behavior that has served a purpose in the past. Another thing that you might see is nothing. This is a picture of some soda cans, because sometimes you can't tell if a soda can has been shaken. It looks just like every other soda can until you open it and an explosion comes out. So it's quite possible that, a lot of trauma is carried in very invisible ways, and there's a good chance that you may see nothing at all. So don't immediately assume trauma, but always be mindful that it's a possibility for anybody that you know. And this is a really important point, which is that trauma is not destiny. If somebody has experienced or is continuing to experience trauma in their lives, this does not mean that there is no chance to experience growth, resilience, positive outcomes. In fact, research suggests that between 30 and 70% of people who have experienced trauma also report positive change and growth that comes out of the traumatic experience. Post-traumatic growth can be defined as the experience of individuals whose development, at least in some areas, has surpassed what was present before the struggle with crisis occurred. The individual has not only survived, but has experienced changes that are viewed as important and that go beyond the status quo. So individuals, have described profound changes that come out of trauma they have experienced in their view of relationships, how they view themselves, how they view their philosophy on life. Brains have plasticity. In fact, a lot of students that you may work with, if they're under the age of 26, their brains are still growing and new connections are still being made. And even for those of us who are far past 26, our brains still have the possibility to forge new connections and new pathways and new ways of thinking about things. So, we all have the capacity to learn and to change. And one of the most beneficial things for anyone seeking to recover from trauma is building healthy, trusting connections with other human beings. Relationships can be an extremely healing and protective factor for somebody who is navigating trauma in their life. And as an educator, you all have the opportunity to be that person for someone and to build that relationship to help somebody heal and experience growth. So just a couple of key takeaways from this part of the presentation. Don't immediately assume trauma, but be aware that it's a possibility, and be mindful of the idea that we can never really understand what somebody is going through internally. Trauma does alter the architecture of the brain in ways that can create obstacles to learning. But however, brains are plastic, trauma is not destiny, and there is always the possibility to experience growth. And lastly, just remembering that all behavior has served a purpose for someone at some point in their lives. Even if it may appear to be maladaptive, it's just important to not slip deeply into focusing on the deficits of how somebody is behaving, but remembering that that behavior has helped them at some point and should be honored and respected. So let's pause for a second. I'm gonna just check the Q&A and the chat and see if anything has come in. It doesn't look like there is anything in the Q&A. Would anybody like to share via chat or via the Q&A anything that is particularly resonating with you? Any questions that are coming up? Are you seeing any of this reflected in the work that you do? So I have my chat window open now. So if anyone would like to share a question or a response or something that you'd be interested in learning more about, this would be a nice time to pause and just get a little bit of reaction from you. Somebody asked how to balance students' difficulty with classroom attendance with lab activities. And that's a really great question. And, you know, I won't pretend to be a professor or to know the different sorts of factors that you have to balance when creating a curriculum or designing activities, but that idea of flexibility, I think, can be really powerful for students if there are chances to do things asynchronously in combination with lab activities that need to be done in person at specific times. That can be really helpful, just giving multiple options for engagement that don't necessarily require being in a certain place at a certain time. And of course, I realize that is not always possible or desirable, particularly if it's a lab activity that involves equipment and group work. But to the extent possible, asynchronous engagement can be really helpful. As we think about all of the CRT bans, it's invalidating to our students of color. This is a really, really polarizing issue right now, I think, in schools. So I appreciate that thought. You know, I think it can be really politicized and polarizing. So, you know, I'm reluctant to say too much, but I would say that making space and, again, leaning into those conversations to the extent that you can, and arguably, you know, teaching is political and you are really involved in students' lives, and one way to validate experiences is to demonstrate that you care and that you're willing to get involved in not just how a student might be reacting to the world around them, but really in your willingness to engage in the root causes behind some of those feelings and those experiences. So there's actually a really interesting article that I could share with participants if they're interested, that has to do with just that sort of role of educators in becoming involved with causes and with joining students side by side to show up for causes that are important to your students. So I'll share that with the organizers after the conference. Productivity and growth being a motivation while students not come out of trauma quickly. Trauma recovery and post-traumatic growth can happen at very different rates for different people. So there's just no way to really know at what point in the journey of recovery and resilience somebody is on. So it's quite possible that somebody might experience that growth more quickly than others. For some, working through trauma and moving past it and growing from it can be a lifelong journey. I see a question about the best way to provide students the opportunity to share they are experiencing trauma. That's a great question, because asking somebody directly whether or not they are experiencing trauma is often, unless you have a real close relationship with a student, is sometimes going to have the opposite effect that you intend, which is putting somebody's walls up. And you know, if you try to move too quickly and try to understand somebody who's not ready to share an experience with you, you may end up creating more of a barrier and a distance with that student. So I think a lot of it just comes down to getting to know your students, becoming connected, showing that you are a safe person, that you're going to listen and you're going to respond and you're going to take them seriously, and try your best to lower obstacles for them. Then you are creating that space for somebody to share with you if they want to, which they may never want to, and that's also okay. All right, well, let's go on to talk a little bit about strategies, some evidence-based strategies specifically for post-secondary educators. And thank you again for your questions and comments. So the very, very first thing to consider when approaching a strategy for trauma-informed practice is to ask yourself, how are you doing? Only a well-regulated adult can help another person. You may have heard of something called mirror neurons, which is a neuron that fires both when somebody acts and also when you observe the same action in somebody else. So it's a neuron mirroring the behavior of the other person. Basically, to put it in another way, people pick up what you put down and sometimes they will give it back. So if you are projecting stress, people are going to pick up on that, and it can actually heighten stress in others. So how you are internally matters. Self-care is care for others. And before you can really help somebody, it's important to take the time to focus on your own emotional and physical health. There is a term called vicarious trauma. Some people call it secondary trauma, indirect trauma, that can occur when you're witnessing or hearing about other people's suffering. So you can actually have your own activated trauma response just by witnessing or hearing stories. And in fact, it may tap into some of your own trauma that you're carrying around. So this is a very real thing, and it's very important to pay attention to avoid compassion fatigue, to avoid burning out. It's very important to ask yourself how you're doing. Is work stressful always or often? How is your own mental health? And just as relationships can be healing for others, you need your own relationships in your life, whether they are friends, loved ones, pets. You need those therapeutic relationships in your life to be able to give back to others. And over the past few years, these challenges have been very real. Educators, as we go through this COVID-19 pandemic, educators are facing things like prolonged campus closures, highly politicized reopenings of campuses, and in fact, as we just mentioned, politicized aspects of teaching in general that just raise the stakes tremendously. Having to teach remotely in sort of emergency style settings without a whole lot of professional development. A lot of us are doing things differently for the first time, so there just isn't a lot of training for how to do things, even if organizationally people want to offer support and resources. Some of this is just truly uncharted territory for both educators and students. Being tasked with supporting students' social and emotional health while dealing with your own, keeping students engaged while bouncing between virtual and in-person learning, adjusting your strategies, learning new technology to accommodate virtual learning, and managing a sort of an unpredictable and changeable workload. These are all extremely real challenges that everyone is still going through. So, more than ever, it's important to take care of yourself before you can really take care of anybody else. And so there are a whole variety of different regulation strategies. What works for you may not work for someone else. So it's just important to get in touch with what seems to make you feel better when you're experiencing what feels like chronic or toxic stress. So for someone that may be walking or running, just getting out in nature, doing some mindfulness or breathing exercises, different things are going to work for different people. So I'd be curious if you have some suggestions to share. You can feel free to put those in the Q&A or the chat, something that has been useful for you in managing your own self-care during this very difficult time. So outside of the self-care aspect, the navigating vicarious trauma, there are a number of different frameworks out there for kind of defining what is trauma-informed. So there are different answers to that question. One that I like, I think it's very kind of comprehensive, but also straightforward, is this framework about trauma-informed practices that SAMHSA put out. And it really revolves around 6 key principles. So, I think as you go forward into the rest of this teaching and learning conference or into, your own practices, these are 6 kind of key ideas that you can just keep track of. You can even print this out and put it up. And if you're trying to ask yourself, is what I'm doing trauma informed? You can go back to something like these 6 key principles and just kind of ask yourself how whatever you're doing is reflecting these principles of trauma-informed practice. So I'll just go through them quickly one by one. So safety has to do with staff members, educators, and the people that you serve feeling both physically and psychologically safe. Trustworthiness and transparency means that decisions are conducted with transparency, and the goal is always building and maintaining trust among educators, students, families, just to the extent possible, not clouding decisions in secrecy, but rather involving everyone in decision making and being willing to explain the why, the hows and the whys behind the choices that you make in class or with your syllabus or with your norms of conduct. Any sort of transparency about why you set those things up the way you did makes it more trauma informed. Peer support, peers and self-help are really key vehicles for building trust and establishing safety and empowerment. So whatever you can do to activate students to support each other, and also as colleagues to support each other in doing trauma-informed work. Nobody should feel like they're doing this alone. Collaboration and mutuality is related, and it's related to that idea that healing happens in relationships. People need to meaningfully share in power and decision-making, and everyone should feel that they have a role in a trauma-informed approach. So trauma-informed practice is not something that you do to a student. It's something that you engage a student in doing with you. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Unique experiences require individualized approaches. So this goes back to that idea of just getting to know your students as much as possible as people, building on what individuals have to offer rather than responding to kind of perceived deficits. Cultural, historical, and gender issues involves trying to actively move past cultural stereotypes and biases, offering culturally responsive services as much as possible, respecting cultural connections, and recognizing that idea of historical trauma and community level trauma. Just because somebody that you work with may not have had an individual experience of trauma, they may be part of a community that at a community level is dealing with trauma, and it's important to just remember and respect that. So Something that you can do if you're part of a team or even as an individual is something called a trauma walkthrough. And this involves starting by just looking, listening, and asking yourself and your colleagues questions about your practices. So, you know, again, you can go back to those 6 key principles and just take a certain aspect of your practice as an individual, like, for example, your curriculum or your syllabus. You can do a trauma walkthrough of your own syllabus and just ask yourself, how does this reflect those core trauma-informed principles? So sort of put yourself in the shoes of a student and just ask yourself, you know, am I making space for choice? Am I reducing ambiguity, and am I explaining why I have created this syllabus the way I did? Am I offering chances for peers to learn from each other? Am I really explicitly addressing cultural, historical, and gender issues? So it's sort of a self-assessment that you can do, really with any aspect of your own teaching or your own practice as an individual. It can also be something that's really powerful to do as part of a team. And there are actually formal assessment tools that exist for this. So the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN, it's a very difficult acronym, but they have a formal assessment tool called a trauma-informed organizational assessment. So this is an actual, you know, thing that you can go and download that will allow you and your team to walk through your practices and be able to self-examine the extent to which they are reflecting those trauma-informed principles. Trauma-informed practice really works best when it is multiple people in a learning environment working and doing it together. To the extent possible, it should be a holistic effort that involves a lot of different people in different roles that are working together on a more kind of holistic culture change. So these are just some examples of those more collective and environmental level actions that educators, administrators, program coordinators can do together. So making that tacit knowledge explicit, helping people know what to expect. You know, I think if you've been in an environment like a higher education institution for so long, it can be easy to forget that there's a lot of just sort of norms, cultural features, expectations that kind of become second nature to you or to people who were raised, you know, with a lot of awareness about this world. The more you can make some of that tacit knowledge explicit, it opens more doors for people to be able to participate and to lower obstacles to engaging. So just, you know, being mindful of when you're kind of assuming that people know the rules of engagement when maybe they don't. Anything you can do to reduce that ambiguity, lower those hassles for students, and that will help with inclusion and reducing trauma. Promoting a sense of belonging by using inclusive language and check-ins. So this can be demonstrating awareness of different family structures, of different cultural norms, just checking your own sort of language that you use about, you know, are you referring to more traditional 2-parent families when you talk about families? Because that may not reflect the experiences of every student in your classroom. Just using that kind of inclusive language is a good ongoing practice to start engaging in if you aren't already. Normalize challenges. You know, if this is a very difficult time for a lot of people, and you likely have a lot of students who are going through it in unique ways. You may have non-traditional adult students who are returning to college and navigating roles of caregiving at the same time that they're trying to be a college student. And that's hard. And the more you can kind of normalize that and say it's hard, can you know, make it seem like it's not, there's not something wrong with somebody if something feels challenging or feels hard. Support mentorship and affinity groups. You can get peers together who are going through similar things to form sort of cohorts with guidance and with some sustained support. That can be extremely powerful. Paying attention to the physical environment, something as simple as, are your exits clearly marked? Are your chairs in the classroom set up in a way that kind of might make somebody feel trapped or like they can't leave? It can be helpful to, at the beginning of a class, just set the norm that, you know, if you need to get up and get water or take care of a physical need that you have, you know, people should be able to feel free to do that. And I understand there may be cases where that, you know, you have to follow your own kind of guidance or institutional protocols on that, but to the extent possible, just making a physical environment that is less likely to be stressful. And always just keeping the focus on systems of support. You know, our role and our job as educators is not to fix somebody or solve somebody's trauma. It's to focus on what we can do to create systems that are responsive and that are helpful to students no matter what they're going through, whether it's directly experiencing trauma or not. So sometimes, you know, no matter how much you engage and invest in these environmental practices, there may be some cases that you as an individual find yourself in a situation that feels tense. You might be speaking to somebody who you suspect may be in that kind of heightened state of a trauma response or experiencing that kind of emotional intensity that we talked about earlier. So in those moments, what do you do? And I would encourage you to check in with your own institutional protocols. A lot of campuses have some guidelines for educators for what to do in a situation where you feel like safety might be an issue, or you know, there may be some institution-specific kind of guidance on these things. So I don't want to be suggesting anything that might be in conflict with what your university provides to you in terms of guidance, but some things that you can consider trying are just trying to bring that temperature down by just take a breath, just take a beat, focus on your breath and your own heart rate, focus on your own response. Because again, if you escalate into a heightened state, those mirror neurons are going to start firing, and it just becomes a highly escalated situation for both people. Give a student options, you know, changing the scenery, go for a walk, go listen to some music. If there's a safe space or quiet space that people can go if they want. But sometimes just making somebody go and be quiet can be harmful because it just gives space for someone to ruminate or build up into a more sort of heightened state. So it can also be helpful to just redirect attention and focus on something else until it feels like the emotions and the brain waves are back in a place where those connections are firing with the prefrontal cortex, and learning or communicating is more possible. Acknowledging what a student is feeling and just reflect what you hear back. See if you're getting it right. Show that you are listening and that you're respecting what they are saying without being defensive. And just keep reassuring someone that you're a safe space. You care about them. You are here to help. It may require just sitting in some silence, not trying to be aggressive with eye contact or asking pointed questions if a student is not ready to do that with you. If a student does ask you questions, answering as directly as possible with as much transparency as possible. And again, just the less ambiguity about what you're going to do next, the better it is to share next steps before you do anything. Again, your institution may have different guidance about what to do after something like that happens. Usually some combination of connecting with other, professionals, other administrators or mental health staff who work with the student. You have a great opportunity to be an advocate for a student after, having engaged in an exchange with them. If you're the first adult to attend directly to a student in crisis, you are in that unique position of being able to help be an advocate and be a voice. So that's a role to take seriously. Documenting what happens is a good idea. Again, likely there are some institutional protocols or guidance about this, about what you can share, what you want to share, and with whom. And just seek support. Again, you are part of a team. Anybody who's working with students is a caring professional in a caring profession. And you should consider yourself as part of a team and in need of your own emotional support, as well as your own encouragement. So debrief with others, find out what it's like for others, ask questions, express your own emotions outwardly, and just check in about what worked, what can be done differently in cases like that. And just on an ongoing basis, investigate and connect with other initiatives, particularly initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion, since that equity framework plays such an important role in trauma-informed practices. And just remember that nobody is going to get things right all the time. We're all involved in a process of continuous improvement and learning, and things change, language changes really fast. So the more you can just be open to listening and making mistakes and learning, the more opportunity that you'll have for your own growth. And just don't be shy about finding out where resources exist and how you can access them and what and whom are available for you in those moments when you want to reach out for help. So that's really the end of the content of my presentation. I'm just putting these 6 key principles back up here because we have a few minutes if anybody wants to share a bit of reflection about ways that you see these key principles being applicable to your own work, or any questions that you have about how they might apply to your own work. So this is kind of coming back to our traffic light activity. So based on some of the ideas we've talked about this evening, can you identify any practices that you may want to stop, continue, or start doing based on these 6 key principles? So I will open up the Q&A again and the chat, and would just love to hear how you think you might be able to apply these ideas in your own work. As an instructional designer, how can I help facilitate strategies when collaborating with faculty? That's a wonderful opportunity that you have to apply some of these strategies to designing instructional approaches that are, characterized by choice. Are you offering flexibility in having students reach a certain place without having to follow a certain path? I think that's a real opportunity to discuss with faculty, like what are the multiple ways that students can arrive to a place of learning in this topic. Again, working to make sure that aspects of instructional design are very transparent. If somebody doesn't understand why this assignment has to be an essay instead of some other type of assignment, it's the more you can be explicit about why an assignment or a piece of curriculum is designed in the format that it is, can really help with motivating students to engage in it, as opposed to wondering, well, why why do I have to write an essay? Why can't this just be an outline or a series of questions or some other format? Is there any research on measuring the outcome of our intervention or instruction? This is another great question. And the field of trauma-informed practices is really in need of some strong evidence of outcomes. We don't work in a lab setting, and it's very difficult to do, research on human beings that allows us to isolate the causal impacts of something like trauma-informed practices. I think there's a lot of interest in the topic and a lot of anecdotal experiences of just how this can totally turn around the experience of education and instruction. But the actual field of causal evidence is, I think, still pretty emergent in this topic. So maybe one of you will design the next evidence-based study that we can cite. There are a lot of strong evidence-based studies around social emotional learning, which shares a lot of the same aspects as trauma-informed practices. There's a lot of intersection between those fields. So there are some really compelling studies about interventions to promote belonging and to promote inclusion, normalizing challenges. There's some pretty good literature on that that I could also share with the coordinators. I think part of it is that it is so individualized and looks different depending on the population of students that you're working with and things that are more likely to be going on in your community. All right, well, I think if there are no other comments or questions, then we may be able to wrap up a few minutes early. And I hope that your time tomorrow is productive. The breakout sessions seem like they will have a lot of opportunities to reflect on some of these practices and see how they can apply to the other aspects of teaching and learning that you'll be spending the day tomorrow discussing. So I hope that you are able to reflect back on this and find this a sort of a useful framework for your next steps. And I encourage you to stay in touch and reach out if you have any questions or want to learn more. I'll put my email up, and really want to thank the organizers for this opportunity, and wish that I could be there in person with you all. Thank you very much.